My name is Helen, and this is the day everything snapped. The late afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows of my Charleston studio. The kind of honey gold light artists dream about. It danced across the polished hardwood floor and touched the edges of my canvases, as if the light itself wanted to be part of my work. I was lost in the slow, meditative strokes of a palette knife against oil paint when the door burst open. "Painting won't pay the bills!" The shrill voice cracked the air like a whip. Margaret, my mother-in-law, uninvited as always. She was a tall woman, angular in the way expensive coats hang stiffly from sharp shoulders. Her heels clicked against the floor as she marched in, eyes already scanning my work like she was searching for a flaw. "Real women don't waste time on hobbies," she barked, and before I could even move, she snatched the painting off my easel. It was Sunrise over Monte Bianco, one of my personal favorites from my mountain series, 15 oil paintings inspired by my time in Europe, the kind of time that shapes the soul. "Margaret, don't," my voice faltered as her manicured fingers dug into the canvas. Rip. The sound was like a blade through my chest. She tore through the mountain peak first, the snowy whites and delicate blues giving way to a jagged scar of raw canvas. My throat burned. "That's worth." She didn't stop. Another rip. Another. Paint flakes drifted to the floor like ashes. If I'd told her the truth, that a London gallery had already offered me $1.8 million for the collection, she wouldn't have believed me. She thought I played with paint because I had nothing better to do. She thought Daniel, her precious son, was the one supporting me. She thought wrong. It wasn't just destruction, it was domination. She was telling me I was beneath her, that my work was meaningless, that I was powerless. "You could at least be useful," she said, tossing the shredded remains onto the floor. "Daniel tells me you don't even cook dinner most nights. What do you do all day, Helen? Dream." Her voice had that mocking lilt I'd come to hate, sweet enough to sound like conversation to an outsider, poison enough to rot the inside of your bones. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms until I felt the warm sting of skin breaking. "Get out," I said quietly. She smiled like she'd won. "This isn't your house to order me around in." She walked toward the far wall where the rest of my mountain series hung in a perfect, symmetrical line. The air in my lungs turned heavy as she stopped in front of the storm over Matterhorn, the centerpiece of the collection. "Margaret," my voice was sharper now, her hand reached for the frame. "Don't you touch that!" I shouted, stepping forward so fast the paintbrush in my hand fell and clattered on the floor. She froze, startled, her fingers an inch from the gilded edge. I stood between her and the canvas, close enough to smell the sharp tongue of her perfume, the same cloying scent she wore to Daniel's and my wedding. The scent I'd never been able to wash from my memory. Her smirk wavered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the paperwork pinned to my corkboard behind me. Official letters on heavy cardstock, each one stamped and signed. Gallery contracts. Authentication certificates. "What's this?" she asked, voice suddenly too casual. "Proof," I said coldly, "that you just destroyed something worth more than your car, your jewelry, and that faux classic villa you brag about in Savannah combined." The color drained from her face just a shade, but I saw it. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time, she didn't have an immediate insult ready. "That can't be real," she muttered, glancing back at the shredded canvas like she was calculating something in her head. I tilted my chin up. "It is. And you just ripped 3 of them. That's nearly $400,000 gone in 5 minutes. The silence between us turned into a taut rope. I could feel it stretching, threatening to snap. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it could bruise my ribs, but my voice stayed calm, colder than the peaks I'd painted. Margaret finally scoffed, tossing her head like a defiant queen retreating from a battle she refused to admit she'd lost. "You always exaggerate. You're just like those people in Europe who think they can sell dirt as historic soil." "You'll see," I said softly, and though I didn't raise my voice, the words carried enough venom to still her steps for just a moment. She left without another word, her heels tapping against the floor like war drums fading into the distance. The front door slammed, shaking the studio walls. I stood there for a long moment, surrounded by silence and the smell of oil paint. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the rage building inside me. It wasn't the kind of rage that burns quick and dies. No, this was the slow kind. The kind that hardens, sharpens, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. I crouched down and gathered the torn pieces of sunrise over Monte Bianco. The edges were frayed, the paint cracked where it had been bent and twisted. I traced a finger over the ruined skyline, remembering how I'd stood in Italy's crisp mountain air, feeling like I was touching the edge of the world. This painting had been more than just paint on canvas. It had been a memory, a piece of my life. And she had destroyed it without hesitation, without remorse. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control. She wanted to break me. She wanted me small, dependent, grateful for scraps of approval. I stacked the ruined pieces neatly on my work table, like evidence at a crime scene. My mind was already sketching plans, not on canvas this time, but in the lines and shadows of revenge. Margaret thought she'd ended something today. She didn't realize she'd only begun the first chapter of a story I'd make sure she'd never forget. I stood in front of the storm over Matterhorn, letting my gaze rest on the swirling clouds and jagged peaks. The scene was turbulent, alive with danger and beauty, just like the storm I could feel building inside me. And I knew one thing for certain: Margaret would pay, not just in dollars. In every way a person can pay. Margaret's son, Daniel, my husband, was no better. If anything, he was worse because he hid his contempt behind that easy southern charm that had fooled me once, but would never fool me again. That night, after Margaret had stormed out of my studio, leaving my paintings in ribbons, I confronted him in the living room. He was slouched in the leather armchair we bought with my gallery earnings, one ankle resting over his knee, a glass of scotch in his hand. The amber liquid caught the lamplight like a trophy. "She destroyed them, Daniel," I said, my voice low but shaking with rage. "Do you understand what she's done? She tore through work worth hundreds of thousands." He rolled his eyes. "Helen, my mother just doesn't understand art." He sipped his drink, unfazed. "She was probably just trying to help you move on." "Move on? Move on?" My laugh was sharp, humorless. "From success? From $1 million deal?" "Don't exaggerate," he said, swirling the scotch like it was the only thing in the world that deserved his attention. I felt the first real crack in whatever was left of our marriage in that moment. Not because of his dismissal, but because I saw it in his eyes, the quiet satisfaction. He liked that she'd destroyed them. It kept me in my place. 2 weeks later, his real betrayal came to light. We were sitting at breakfast, me with my coffee, him with some spreadsheet open on his laptop, when he said casually, "Oh, I almost forgot. I moved some money from our joint account to help Brent with that new venture in Miami." I set my mug down slowly. "How much?" "About $120,000, he said without flinching. "It's an investment, Helen. We'll get it back double." An investment. With Brent, the same Brent who had bankrupted a beach club in Naples, Florida, and walked away leaving his partners in debt. The same Brent whose only skill was pouring cheap whiskey into expensive bottles and calling it craft. My fingers curled around the edge of the table. "You took 6 figures from our account without asking me." Daniel didn't even look up from his screen. "It's my money too." That was the moment I realized both he and his mother saw me as ornamental. A painter wife was fine for dinner parties, but never as someone with financial control. They thought I was a pretty bird in a gilded cage, and they didn't care if they clipped my wings. But they had underestimated me. Over the past 3 years, I had quietly built a separate account under my maiden name, Helen Archer. Small private commissions here, a secret sale there, payments funneled through a trusted accountant who understood discretion. I never touched that account for household expenses, never spoke of it. By the time Daniel's little investment surfaced, that account held $480,000, untouched, untouchable. That night, I stood in my studio staring at the remnants of my ruined mountain series. The shredded edges looked like teeth marks. Margaret had wanted to break me, Daniel had wanted to control me. They had both succeeded in making one thing crystal clear: if I didn't take everything from them, they would take everything from me. So I started making calls. The first was to Sofia Rossi, an old friend from my time in Italy. Sofia ran Rossi Auction House in New York, one of the most respected in the country. We'd met years ago when she was just starting out, and I had been a young artist painting in tiny rented flats in Florence. We'd shared coffee, cigarettes, and dreams in cheap cafes, swearing that one day we'd both be at the top. When she picked up, her voice was as rich as I remembered. "Helen Archer, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I want in," I said. "In what?" "Not just as an artist," I replied, my voice steady. "As an owner." There was a pause, the kind where you can hear someone calculating. "That's not cheap." "I have nearly $500,000 in liquid funds," I said, "and access to art that will sell for 10 times that. But I don't just want to sell through you, I want a stake. I want my name in the building." Sophia chuckled, low and approving. "You sound dangerous, Helen. I like it." "I am dangerous," I said. "And I'm ready to prove it." We spoke for over an hour. By the time we hung up, she had agreed to bring me on as a silent partner for now. I would funnel my best work through Rossi, build my reputation and the auction house's brand simultaneously, and when the time was right, I would use my ownership stake to influence every sale, every client list, every transaction. But this wasn't just about art anymore. This was about control and revenge. Margaret believed she was untouchable because she had money and influence in Savannah's old guard social circles. Daniel believed he was the breadwinner, the decision-maker, the one steering the ship. They were about to learn that I could burn their little empire to the ground without ever raising my voice. The first step was secrecy. I didn't tell Daniel about my meeting in New York the following week. I didn't tell him about the series of high-value commissions I had lined up with buyers from Chicago, Boston, and London. I let him believe I was still sulking in my studio, licking my wounds. In truth, I was sketching the first lines of a different kind of masterpiece, one where every brushstroke was a calculated move against them. I started small. I used my own funds to pay off the remaining balance on my Charleston studio, transferring the deed into my maiden name. That way, when Daniel's inevitable debts caught up with him, they couldn't touch the one place that was truly mine. Then I began gathering information. Quietly, patiently, I learned that Margaret's investment property in Savannah was tied up in a messy refinancing deal. I discovered that Daniel's Miami venture with Brent was already bleeding cash and months behind on permits. Every bit of information was a color in my palette, and I planned to blend them until I had the perfect shade of ruin. Revenge is like oil paint. If you rush it, the color's muddy and the image loses its power. But if you let it dry between layers, it becomes permanent. Standing in my studio one night, I looked again at the single surviving painting from my Destroyed Mountain series. It was small, a 16 by 20 canvas of a cliffside at sunset, but it had survived because I'd hidden it behind a stack of frames. Its colors were warm, but the cliff's shadow cut across the lower half like a warning. That's when it struck me. I wasn't just going to recover from this. I was going to own them. Their money, their influence, their comfort. Everything they thought they had over me, I would strip away, piece by piece, until they had to crawl for scraps. And when the time came, I would make sure they understood exactly who had painted their downfall. 6 months later, I stood in the marble foyer of the Rossi auction house in New York, watching the city's wealthiest collectors swirl through the room like peacocks. The chandeliers cast warm pools of light over gilded frames. Crystal glasses clinked, and the air smelled faintly of champagne and ambition. My Mountain Series 2 hung in a perfect arc along the west wall, each canvas more vivid and precise than the last. This time, the mountains weren't serene. They were jagged, powerful, dangerous. Sophia had insisted we keep the unveiling exclusive, invitation only, black tie, no press until after the sales. Scarcity drives hunger, she'd said, and she was right. Every collector in the room had come ready to fight with their wallets. Margaret and Daniel walked in precisely at 8:10 p.m., late enough to draw eyes but early enough to claim they weren't making an entrance. Margaret wore a deep emerald gown, her diamonds catching the light, her smile razor-thin. Daniel's tuxedo looked perfect on the surface, but I caught the stiffness in his shoulders. He had no idea why they were really here, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I greeted them with a polite nod, like they were strangers. "Daniel, Margaret, welcome." Margaret's eyes swept the room, assessing, judging. Helen, I didn't realize you'd moved up in the world. This is impressive. Her tone made it sound like a compliment and an insult in one. It's not my world, I said, letting the words hang for just a beat too long. I own part of it now. Daniel's brow furrowed, but before he could ask, Sophia appeared, all charm and precision. Mr. and Mrs. Archer, we're so glad you could join us. Helen's collection has caused quite a stir. She gestured toward the Mountain Series too. Shall we? The first painting, Avalanche at Dawn, opened the auction. The bidding started at $350,000. Within 30 seconds, it had climbed past $600,000. Margaret's expression tightened, her lips a thin white line. Daniel shifted beside her, glancing from the bidders to the stage, as if trying to work out how this could possibly be happening. I stayed silent, watching them from the corner of my eye. The numbers weren't just money, they were proof. Every bid was another nail in the coffin of their condescension. By the time the third piece, Ridge of Storms, sold for $780,000, Margaret's fingers were digging into her clutch hard enough to leave marks. Daniel leaned toward me, voice low. You never told me you were selling here. You never asked what I was doing, I replied, my voice even. You were too busy investing in Miami. His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. When the final painting, Summit in Firelight, hit the stage, the room was electric. The bidding started at $500,000 and flew upward in dizzying leaps. At $1.1 million, two collectors locked eyes and refused to back down. I could feel the tension coiling, snapping with every raised paddle. Sold, the auctioneer finally declared, his gavel striking the podium like a gunshot. $1,350,000. The room erupted in polite applause. I turned to Margaret, my voice sweet enough to make her flinch. You were right, I said. Painting won't pay the bills. It'll buy the entire building. Her face drained of color. What did you say? I smiled. With tonight's sales, I'll clear $4.2 million after the house is cut. That's enough to buy the Charleston property outright, which I already have. The deed is in my name alone. Daniel went pale, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to swallow air. Yes, I said, cutting him off. While you were burning money in Miami, I was buying the ground out from under you. For the rest of the evening, I ignored them completely. They lingered near the back, silent, while collectors congratulated me, praised my work, and handed me business cards with discreet offers for future commissions. By midnight, the room had thinned to the diehards, those who stayed late to gossip over the final glasses of champagne. I stood on the mezzanine, looking down at Margaret and Daniel as they prepared to leave. Margaret's shoulders were stiff, her lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painful. Daniel kept glancing toward the exit, like he couldn't get out fast enough. Before they could step into the elevator, I descended the stairs and intercepted them. Margaret, I said softly, so only she could hear, I have to thank you. She blinked. For what? For tearing up my first Mountain Series. Without that motivation, I might never have made these. And then I wouldn't have had the pleasure of watching you sit through this evening. Her nostrils flared. You're playing a dangerous game, Helen. Oh, Margaret, I said, leaning in so close she could feel my breath. I'm not playing. I'm winning. I let them leave without another word, their defeat trailing behind them like a bad perfume. The night wasn't just about money, though the money was exquisite. It was about the look on Margaret's face when she realized she could no longer dismiss me, and the tightness in Daniel's jaw when he understood I had outmaneuvered him without lifting a finger in his direction. The next morning, the headlines hit. Helen Archer's Mountain Series 2 sells for record $4.2 million at Rossi Auction House. Sophia made sure the press release included every detail, from the attendance list to the fact that I was now a co-owner of the auction house. My phone buzzed all day with messages from collectors, galleries, even old acquaintances who suddenly remembered we were friends. Daniel didn't call. Margaret didn't dare. I poured myself a glass of champagne in the studio that night, standing before the one surviving painting from the original series. The colors glowed in the lamplight, defiant. I traced the brushstrokes with my eyes, letting the satisfaction settle deep in my bones. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. This was just the first public blow, the one everyone would remember when the rest of my plan unfolded. Margaret thought tonight had humiliated her. Daniel thought losing the Charleston house was the worst of it. They had no idea what was coming next. And I would make sure they saw every single step of their own ruin, up close, in exquisite detail. Revenge, like art, is all about the layering. You don't throw paint at a canvas and call it a masterpiece. You build it, stroke by stroke, letting each layer dry until the picture becomes undeniable. By the time I reached the final stage of my plan, I had been working on it for months. The first brushstroke was information. My stake in the Rossi auction house gave me access to more than just art and buyers. It gave me access to transactions, networks, and whispers that didn't make it into polite conversation. The wealthy love art not just for beauty but for what it can hide: illicit money, offshore transfers, and the kind of deals they think no one will question if they happen in a gallery. And that's how I found it. Brent's Miami business wasn't just failing, it was laundering money through fake art purchases. On paper, his bar was hosting exclusive exhibitions, selling emerging artist work for obscene amounts to buyers who didn't care if the paintings were any good, because they never intended to hang them anywhere. The transactions were all conveniently routed through a shell company that Daniel had invested in with our stolen $120,000. I didn't go to the police right away. No, I built the case in silence, documenting every transfer, every invoice, every sham painting. Sophia, with her deep Rolodex of legal and investigative contacts, introduced me to a retired FBI agent who still consulted on art fraud. He didn't even have to dig far. Brent and Daniel had practically gift-wrapped the evidence. The night before the raid, I slept like a child. There's a special kind of peace in knowing the storm is about to break, and you're the one holding the lightning. The next morning, the FBI walked into Daniel's Savannah office. I wasn't there, but I'd arranged for the call to come through from a friend in the building. She told me later how Daniel had gone from smug to ashen in seconds, his face folding in on itself when they showed him the warrant. They boxed up his files, confiscated his phone, and led him out in front of his staff. By that afternoon, the story had already broken on the local news. Local businessman tied to art-based money laundering scheme. The footage of Daniel being escorted to an unmarked car ran on a loop. Margaret called that evening. I let it ring twice before answering. "Helen," she said, her voice trembling, "we're ruined. Do you understand? The house." I cut her off, letting my words land with the sharpness of a palette knife. "That's my house now, bought with my money. If you set foot on it, you're trespassing." There was a pause, then a shaky inhale. "You planned this," she whispered, half in horror, half in awe. "Yes," I said simply and hung up. 3 days later, I watched from my upstairs window as they moved out. Margaret's once perfect posture was hunched, her green gown from the auction long replaced by a sagging cardigan. Daniel was pale and silent, loading boxes into a rented van like a man already counting the years he might serve. I didn't go outside, I didn't wave, I didn't need to. My silence was louder than anything I could have said. When they were gone, I walked into the front hall of my Charleston house. The afternoon light was soft, almost golden, and in the center of the hallway wall hung the one surviving piece from my destroyed mountain series. It was small, barely 2 feet across, but the colors burned like embers. I had hidden it the day Margaret tore through my studio, sliding it behind a stack of old frames. It had survived by chance, but it meant more to me than anything else in my collection. Its title? Patience Before the Storm. Every time I passed it, I remembered that day in the studio, the rip of canvas, the smugness on Margaret's face, the weight of my own rage. And every time I reminded myself that patience was my weapon as much as aggression. Without it, I might have lashed out too soon. Without it, I wouldn't have been able to dismantle them piece by piece. In the weeks that followed, their world collapsed. Brent's bar was seized by federal authorities, and his investors, including Daniel, faced civil suits on top of the criminal charges. Margaret's Savannah villa was repossessed when she defaulted on her refinanced mortgage. The society pages, once eager to print her name, went silent. Meanwhile, my name was everywhere, not in gossip columns but in art journals, business profiles, and national features. The Rossi auction house's profits had doubled in 6 months, thanks in part to my collection, and I was no longer a silent partner. My title now read, Vice President, Fine Arts and Acquisitions. Sometimes at night I'd pour a glass of wine and walk through the rooms of my Charleston house. The ocean air would drift through the open windows, carrying the faint sound of waves breaking against the shore. And I'd think about how far I'd come from the woman in the studio, watching her work destroyed, to the one standing here with everything they tried to take from me. People like Margaret and Daniel believe in ownership as power, property, money, influence. But what they never understood is that power isn't in what you hold. It's in what you can take away. And I had taken everything from them. One evening, Sophia called from New York. You know, she said, her voice warm with amusement. You could have just walked away, sold your work, made your money, and ignored them forever. I could have, I agreed. But you didn't. No, I said, smiling into the dark. I painted them into a corner. And then I signed my name. The last thing I did before turning in that night was walk past Patience before the storm. I rested my fingers lightly on the frame, feeling the texture of the wood beneath the varnish. I thought about the next series one would paint, not mountains this time, but oceans. Deep, endless, and just as dangerous as I could be when provoked. Revenge wasn't just sweet, it was lasting. It was profitable. And for me, it was only the beginning.